Hi, Bisila.
Hello.
Um, Thank you so much for meeting with me. I wanted to start by talking a little bit about how we met, and it was in 2023, I think, when we were in Collect, and it was like just after the pandemic, this first public show. When we were there with our gallery with Throne Contemporary, and it was quite a seismic moment for our practices, I think. And since then, we've sort of had this kind of fledgling friendship, kind of creative and all other aspects of life kind of jumping in. Um, and I was thinking about the fact that our career in ceramics has kind of been running in parallel. Like we both started at Hackney City Farm and at Turning Earth. But we also have come from different professional backgrounds, right?
Yes.
Mine being architecture and design, and yours is translation and international relations. Sounds so interesting. In fact, we've not talked a lot about languages, but I think we will in this conversation. So anyway, I wanted to ask if you want to start by telling us a bit about yourself.
Yeah. Well, thank you. And yeah, my name is Bisila Noha. I make with ceramics mostly. And as Nina was saying, we've met through our practices. I've been in London for over 11 years, born and raised in Spain. I'm half Spanish, half Equatorial Guinean. And yeah, I'm really excited about this conversation because I really love your work. I really love you. So I'm really honored to be able to dive into this collection with you, Ramona. So, I mean, you were saying how, I mean, we both come from different backgrounds and yours is architecture more specifically. So, and there's something I noticed that when architects make, especially like ceramics, there's you can tell to a degree. So I'm curious to know how it influences your work and if it's helpful, if it's freeing, if it's limiting, and if you are going through like this process of like trying to detach yourself from that,
Mm,
if you think that is actually what is holding everything.
yeah. Yeah, no, I think in my case, and especially with this collection, it is clear that I have this architectural background, and the work is sort of trying to make sense of place and memory. And so, in a way, architecture is a useful way to enter these kinds of topics. In fact, in my architectural studies, I've always been drawn to notions of time and space and memory and how these things are really layered in our cities. And a sort of sense of like time traveling, or how your sort of spatial memory is really different to the real thing. And then also how with migration you have these distortions of how you remember things. So that was always an interest of mine in architecture school, and it carries on now in this, especially in this particular collection. I'm glad you brought up that question, though. I think there have been times when I almost want to pretend I haven't studied architecture, but really, I think now I can see this integration of the thinking that we learned in architecture school. I really learned to appreciate materials and processes, and to sort of really get into the purity of things. Architects are often, or especially where I studied, quite purist. We really want to see how something's made and express that. And that's something I really enjoy in working with different materials. I think also the other thing about architectural education in the UK, because I studied in London, is that it sort of teaches you how to see. I think that's the starting point. You learn to look at things, like really look, and you learn to question things, and to conceptualize. And so I think that's kind of relevant to anything. And I find in my making practice that's just so helpful. It's a really big part of it.
From Framenti talks about like archaeological digs and maps, and kind of like looking into looking for the new in different changing paths. I think that's how you refer to it. So what have you learned about yourself in the process of making these pieces? And because this collection is something that you've been making or working on for a while, how do you relate to it as you evolve as a person and as an artist?
Yeah, thanks. That's a great question. I mean, so I think archaeological digs and maps are really interesting, especially again, or not again, but in the context of Malta and post-colonial thinking, because it depends who is drawing the map and who is making that architectural dig, archaeological dig. And in our history, it often was somebody else. And I find that so interesting because then our understanding of these histories, whether it was via the maps or via trying to understand past civilizations, is through someone's interpretation, and they bring their whole culture and assumptions about society, and then it changes and it changes and it changes. So at one point we think a map is information and it's something concrete, as the same with like what we learn in a museum of archaeology, and then you realize, oh no, that changes too. And I really like that. I really like, and I suppose that's what the work is about, this idea that something's changing, we're searching for something, we're trying to understand something, but we're just a piece of a much bigger story, and we're just one interpretation in a particular time, right? So I think that's really fascinating to me, and I enjoy it, and I enjoy finding, when things sort of change and evolve, and finding new interpretations. With the pieces, I think like what happens is the making is so intuitive, and so when I first started making them, I think I was searching, and there was this kind of like anxiety. I was making these things and cutting them up and putting them together, and I didn't know where it was going. And when I make them, I never know where it's going. But it was almost an expression of my own uncertainty at the time. So in a way, you're asking what I learned. I think I am in a different place now. So looking back at the work, it's easier to see that that's what was going on. Because now I am sort of more drawn to starting to slow down in a way. Like that work was kind of like a hurry. It was like this kind of movement, like what next? And this kind of chopping and reconfiguring was an expression of that. So that's sort of where I feel I'm getting at now. Like, what have I learned? When I look at that work, I can see that energy is in it.
And it's also that kind of like having lots of things, like making lots of little pieces to then create this one thing, which is something I had a bit of a similar process, but like going into like making things that had many different functions. So it can be a cup, but it can be a this and this and that. And then there's that, like, which can be anxiety, or it can be that hunger to explore the material and this new practice, because if it's at the beginning or something.
Yeah.
And so how surprised are you when you've made all of these pieces and then you start assembling them, and how surprised are you with what comes out? Or are you sometimes like you've made so many and then you cannot find this thing that really speaks to you? Like, does that ever happen? And so like, how do you manage that disappointment? Or
Yeah, I mean, it does, it feels that way, like, how it is for all of us who work with clay. When you open the kiln, there's that feeling of like kind of like excitement and fear at the same time. And when I have all these pieces, it's almost like just opening a jigsaw puzzle, and you sort of like, how's it all going to come together? And I can spend a lot of time playing with them and trying to work out what is this one about, and often there's a bit of a question of scale within it. But then slowly, as I play with them, some kind of association comes up. It's almost like a story comes up where you're like, oh, okay, so this is all about like this flow, like some river and a back street, or this is all about a bit more of confusion, so nothing's facing each other. Or this one's more about positive and negative space, and then it becomes more of an enclosure. So somehow, and it is really surprising and unpredictable. And I do throw away a lot. I make much more than I need. So if I'm making a piece that needs 25 blocks, I'll make at least 35, if not 40. And I don't immediately throw them away, but I do kind of keep loads. They sit around for ages. Sometimes they find themselves being placed in something else, and sometimes I do sometimes throw them away when I just think this particular one doesn't work. There's something not quite right, and I don't really have any reservations about throwing away things. Yeah.
I think that's very healthy. I love throwing away things.
Okay. Yeah.
Um, I'm gonna read something from the text that goes with the collection that kind of really drew my attention, and then I'll ask something about it. So you say, I began to notice that in migrating, I had started to lose parts of my identity, and I wasn't sure what to keep, what to accept, what to fight for, what to discard. So speaking of like, well, the idea of like not being afraid of like throwing things away, but then also like the surprise in the process and the like, yeah, like putting all those parts together.
Yeah.
Uh, and then kind of bringing into your own experience, like being in London as a migrant, like have you ever been surprised by how your new home has changed you? Which again, the same way that you've now understood a little bit what was going on when you were starting making these pieces.
Mm-hmm.
With all of this process, we realize about them later, and then also for you that you right now are in Malta, like maybe as you have come back. So yeah, if you could talk a little bit about this.
Yeah. Okay. So I moved to London when I was 19. And obviously I thought I was an adult then, but in retrospect, you realize that was, I spent a lot of my formative years in London. And when I first arrived, I loved the sense of freedom. I could go to the corner shop in my pajamas and no one would even look at me. And I was coming from a very small conservative island, and in which when you go out, you always bump into someone So it felt really exciting, and I actually loved the anonymity of moving to London at first. Um, Obviously, there's all the other stuff, the museums and all the other things, but there was just something so liberating about almost like being able to try out anything, and there was no one to remind you who you are. And I think at that age, that was really nice. Um, so then I returned to Malta almost 20 years later, and what I've enjoyed coming back is that, I don't mind being the anomaly here, even though, at first that was hard to, in the, obviously I've always come and gone. And in the early years, it used to feel hard for people, they would talk to me in English, not Maltese. And I started to notice, oh, wow, something's changing that I can't perceive, but the local people here in my own country don't think I'm from here anymore. And that was a strange feeling, but I think especially since I've come back, I feel totally fine with it. And I think that's perhaps because of living in London and getting used to being a bit of an outsider and sort of finding your own. I think what's nice about London is that you sort of find your own group of outsiders to be with. And that's so great, So in a way, I think right now anyway, in the beginning of this return, that seems to be one of the prevailing things. I do feel really comfortable to be back with all these different aspects of myself. Maybe that relates back to the work in a way.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, that's beautiful. And yeah, I think I can relate to the challenge of like, yeah, being like seen as an outsider in your own country, but then like going through that growth and being like, well, yes, and this is who I am, and this is
Yeah.
makes me special. Yeah. Is it, I mean, you've been there, not, you haven't been there for long, but do you think that also your creativity might be changing by being in a different context?
Yeah, I expect so, because I think a lot of the work I made in London was a bit about, there was definitely elements of sort of nostalgia and a sense of forgetting and remembering. And now I'm here. So in a way, I don't need to delve into that sort of thing. So I think that's really interesting. I think nostalgia and forgetting and remembering and being away from your country is really important as a way of reflecting. But no, it's interesting to be back now and sort of not have that coming through the work at all.
Yeah, more opportunities, more things that might come up,
Yeah.
like a richer, perhaps like practice.
Let's see.
Oh, very interesting.
Mm.
And going back to Fragmenti, so you made the clay, but then people might not realize that there's also another material that is holding the whole thing together, which is the metal, which you have done in a foundry. Is it in East London? Am I right?
Yeah, it starts out in East London. They moved to Greenwich.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a metal worker called Adam who has a really great workshop, and I've always taken things to him and worked out how to create frames, backing plates, stands, and yeah. So, sorry, you were going to ask a question.
How would you answer it, kind of like, because I'm curious also, like how important is that part of the process to the final piece? Or is it like because you've already decided how it's gonna look like, then that is gonna, or that dictates the metal? Or is there, do you allow like that conversation with Adam and explore how to finish the pieces?
Um, I think it's becoming more and more. So I mean, besides Adam, I really love collaborating, and I think it's a really important part of my practice. Like more time passes and the more perhaps confident I'm feeling, it feels really important. And I do have a set idea, but I really enjoy being in someone else's workshop where they're the expert and allowing that to then inform my idea. I mean, again, this really goes back to training as an architect, because that's obviously how architects work. And I find it really fun. I really find it fun being in a space with lots of things that I don't fully understand, and just kind of like absorbing all this images, materials, kind of like creative ideas. Um, but yeah, so the process, I think it's becoming more fluid. In the beginning, I mainly went to him just to sort of make a backing plate, and we had a good chat and we worked out how to make it lighter. But slowly now I go a bit more loose. And there's something we kind of have to work out a little bit more together. So now I've ended up being in his workshop, um, patinating the pieces, so he's almost like, you can go off and do this whilst I do that. So it's just nice. It's great.
Yeah, I love that. I
Mm.
love, yeah, metal studios is something that I really like. There's like I don't know how you feel about this, but like from coming with clay, which is very much like the hand onto the material, and it's something that I've always said, like, this is what I love about clay. But now that I'm working with all of these tools, I'm like, well, like, give me a grind, like I'm gonna grind there, and I feel so powerful. So I find that is really cool that you can engage with it, like, and be like really active in the process of finishing your work. Yeah.
Yeah, and also like the idea of melting stuff, and I mean, not just metal, but melting material. I mean, obviously also clay goes through that ceramic process, but there's something so kind of magical about the things that happen in the metal workshops.
Yeah.
Mm.
Nice. Right, like this is a bit more like political, perhaps, as a question. And so, well, you come from Malta, and when thinking about colonialization and like the post-colonial narratives and countries, maybe Malta doesn't go like straight away onto the list. So because I'm a woman of color, and then it makes it very evident to a degree, and then also because it's Africa, then it's just kind of like a no-brainer there. I'm curious to know how it feels to come from and to be dealing, because I think that that's a conversation that is really prominent now in Malta during the Biennale and all of these things, right? So how is it to come from like a white majority European country that has a colonial past, and how maybe that influences the Maltese experience and history and today, and the conversation in Malta today.
Yeah, I mean, it is really complex. On So yeah, we fall between the cracks. Obviously Malta is really small, so in many instances people don't even know about it, let alone its history. It could be frustrating living in the UK, realizing, when I moved there, realizing that people didn't know about us yet, let alone know that Britain had colonized Malta, was quite frustrating, And it's that experience, I know you see it a lot in many movies of people who've come from the empire, come to the sort of this like mother country and realize you're kind of not known here, whereas you've grown up knowing about them all the time. So there's that. Obviously, I grew up in a bit of a different context, but there's still elements of that. I mean, and you were mentioning whiteness, and that's, I think, a little bit of a sticky topic in the sense of, I don't think Maltese people have always been considered to be white, as strange as that sounds, because I think whiteness is a kind of construct. And I also think, even though somehow we've managed to slip in through the back door, I don't think let's say Maltese people would never be the gatekeepers of whiteness, let's think of it that way. But obviously that may sound ridiculous because, I am white as well. But Malta is on the edge of the east, west, north, and south. It's kind of right in the middle of the Mediterranean. And I think sort of this idea of defining one kind of person is really stifling if you're from a place like that. And so it's kind of frustrating. People assume I'm Spanish or Portuguese, but it's it is really different, as much as there are obvious similarities. I think the best example, which might interest you, is with your linguistic background, is that Maltese is a Semitic language. So speaking Maltese means that we can speak with other North Africans. It's an old Arabic language. It's the only language in the world with a Latin alphabet that is Semitic. So again, it's that bridge between the two. But also Malta is one of the most devout Catholic countries in the world. So in church, when we sing and praise God, we say Allah. Now, I grew up here and I never questioned this. But when I went to the UK, I started to understand that people thought Allah meant a Muslim God. Whereas I was just like, no, that's just the word for God in Arabic languages. And so when I would explain that that's just God, I realized that it was very fascinating to Western people. Again, Western is a funny one as well. So I think that's such a good example of how we bridge a lot of different situations. And I think it sort of makes me sort of think about this idea of mixed cultures and sort of why do we have such narrow ideas of what people can and can't be, right? Of what language overlaps with what religion, or what color skin overlaps with what history. And perhaps our country really brings that to the fore if you interrogate it enough, Being post-colonial means that often, especially if coming from an old British colony, there are many languages, people speak different languages. Our grandparents grew up in Victorian times. They spoke Italian at home, they spoke English to one group, they spoke Maltese to another group of people. They were kids during World War II. Malta was the most bombed place on earth in World War II. No one knows that either. And the population experienced a mass starvation. So, they had a lot of trauma, but as part of this idea of being white and so being different to other colonies, we were given a history that was like, oh no, we did very well under the British. We weren't like the other colonies, so in a way, trying to be European and holding on to this kind of Christian identity meant that I think many things were not interrogated. So then now that's coming up much more. So these stories are starting to be interrogated much more. So, my parents were born under the British Empire. I was born in the first 20 years of our country's independence. In my childhood, it was a really tumultuous political time, and the main conversations in politics were, are we part of the Maghreb or are we part of Europe? And the truth is, we're part of both. Malta is defined as part of the Maghreb in terms of geological, so we are, we're part of that culture, and we are also part of Europe. But when you're in a place like this and you're trying to fit with one idea or another, you almost lose something if you admit to something else. There's that kind of duality. So that's completely our story. Since joining the EU, so you know, when I was about 20, we joined the EU, and I think there's been a really interesting conversation about our identity. I think there's been a more supported art scene, and that's really led to a lot of interesting music and writing and historical research into things in our past that were not spoken about, or at least I was never taught about them in my education. Things like the starvation, piracy, slavery, prostitution, you know, poverty. These things we didn't really learn about when we were kids. So it's really interesting to see all these books being published and all this information coming up. But I also think probably my perspective, it may be that if a Maltese person hears me talk about this, they might not agree. Obviously, there are many different experiences. And I think because I've lived in London and I've met so many diverse people, especially people from other British colonies, I started to realize there was a real connection there. We had a really shared history. So, you know, I've had so many conversations where we're like, oh my God, we're so similar, yet we're from such different parts of the world, you know, with a friend from Zimbabwe, with another friend from India. And that's so fascinating, really. But then the other thing I realized being in London, again, because we're such a small country, it's not like I've got this massive society of Maltese people that I hang out with. So I really started to realize that our identity is not so much about a landmass, it's completely about the sea. And the sea is about trade, it's about communication, it's about people passing and leaving and taking, and we're just this dot in the middle. So, you know, that kind of happened all the time. Our whole history is like that. And therefore I noticed I really connected with people from the Mediterranean. So it didn't have to be, you know, if you're from a certain part of Turkey, France, wherever, you know, like whether that's Morocco or, you know, Palestine, Israel, everyone I met, if they were from the coast, then there was that connection and it felt like, oh, actually we are the same people, because there was that movement, and I don't know, maybe genetically too. So it's interesting. It's sort of, I think the more I've grown up and had to constantly explain being Maltese, especially in the UK, I've sort of started to understand really nuanced identity, I suppose.
Wow, thanks for that.
Yeah,
It's
yeah.
really, really interesting and fascinating because, yeah, ignorance on my part. So thank you. And is the so correct me if I'm wrong, but the Biennale this year, which was the first Biennale in Malta in history, and that was they were talking about piracy, so that was part of the kind of like the concepts of it, like the curatorial, yeah. And is that, you think, like influencing the the conversation more broadly, or is it too soon? Like anything, like sometimes like artists like go farther ahead and then it takes longer, but like, yeah, how is that connection?
I honestly don't know. I think it probably is too soon. I think often with these things you need more than one for it to
Yeah,
start to enter the consciousness of of sort of local people. It's really hard to gauge how that affected or who, or you know, I think it's really unclear. Certainly as artists it was amazing because we met each other and these themes were shared, and that was already an interesting start, but we'll have to wait and see.
yeah,
Mm.
that's exciting. Something else I wanna read, and it's kind of like the last thing I kind of like prepare, because you have a quote on your statement from Italo Calvino,
Yeah.
that I would love you to talk about because it relates, well, things that we've touched upon, like from, I think, like place, architecture, maps, identity, journeys, and stuff. So it goes, arriving at each new city, the traveler finds again a past of his that he didn't know he had. The foreignness of what you no longer are or no longer possess lies in wait for you in foreign and possessed places?
I mean, it's funny. Every time I read it, I think, I don't think I understand it, but in a way, that's what I like about it, you know?
Mhm.
It's sort of, and it's really ambiguous to me anyway. And I kind of find that interesting. I think it sort of talks about this idea of, you know, sort of leave where you came from and go somewhere else, and then you discover other pieces of yourself. And this kind of something about that, I think, you know, that's what I like about it. Maybe that's because it's really talking about my experience and currently the experience of returning. Um, but I like that there's this kind of sense of knowing and not knowing, and sort of something that is not fully tangible. And this feeling of time and of place and sort of memories, and then discovery of you, both yourself and the place at the same time. Um, yeah, I really love that. And, you know, it's from Invisible Cities, which is a, I don't know if you know this book. It's a really beautiful concept about the story of Marco Polo, talking about all these different cities that he's traveled to, and each one is like really fantastical and very sensory, and each chapter is a different city. But there's this kind of interpretation that he's just talking about Venice, which is where he's from, and each time he just tells it in a different way. And I really like that, like this idea of places changing and our memory, or even, you know, he's traveling, so he's far, and these kinds of associations. And again, I think that's, you know, this particular work is a lot about that. It's about this kind of confusion and this relationship between the place and the self. So I kind of like it, and I like that the quote is unclear to me. Maybe
Yeah,
other people get it.
it is. No, I had to read it many times, and then
Yeah.
I think like the sonority of it I really like as well, because it's a bit like you are on a ship kind of thing. So I love that.
Mm.
I think I don't know if there's anything else you would like to share about the collection.
You know, in a way, I was thinking about this idea of connecting my architectural education with this post-colonial identity, and then why am I carving the clay? And that's really related because um, Malta is made of this one kind of rock, this limestone. It's a bit of a lie, there are five, but really it's made of this like really yellow sedimentary rock, limestone. And I'm trying to see if you can see any around me, but strangely you can't. So it's really typical that it would be all over the place. And the island, you know, until the dawn of concrete, has been kind of carved, and the stone that's been carved has been built, and it's just kind of constant reconstitution of the same material. And the stone is quite soft when you first quarry it, so there are a lot of carved spaces on the island. And a lot of the carved spaces feel like they predate colonialism, or colonialism also took this stone and shaped it into something, and there's, you know, you can read into that. But I always felt that the rock itself and the carving of it felt like maybe something quite vernacular. And that's where, when I started making with clay, I fell on this idea of carving, and I loved it. I loved the sort of carving the clay, and then it sort of starts to look like something found, because its faults come through, you know, you sort of expose these fault lines. But it was like, for me, a real direct reference to these spaces that you find in Malta, both interior and also especially on the coastline, lots of carved things, and they're all quite mysterious, and there's always a sense of time, you know, and there's the carving and then the weathering. And so that's that's really quite important to this collection, and to why I've chosen to make it the way I have. It's really referencing some kind of idea about this rock and the way it's being carved, you know, it's referencing in the work.
Wow.
Yeah,
Thank you. I think that's a really great way to
yeah, I
end the
think so.
conversation. Yeah.
Yeah, that's great. I'm going to stop the recording.
Yeah.